This prize is very significant because it recognizes the need for South Asian literature both in English and in its translation into English. Now, let me tell you why we started this prize, because I'm asked all the time, why a South Asian Literature Prize? Well, we started off as a group sponsoring the Jaipur Literature Festival. And after a year or so, we thought there is a niche in the market for a prize like this. There wasn't anything like this. And that is how the prize started. In fact, my son gave this idea, Manhar, that we should have a prize. This is something we should also do. And since I, as they keep saying, head the philanthropy side of the company, I think philanthropy is only sustainable if you really enjoy what you are putting your money into. And I love literature. And therefore, I think it was important. It can be sustainable because as long as we like what we are doing, you'll keep sort of sponsoring it and doing it year on year again. For me, literature is an important aspect of observing people, nations, and my journey began with this prize. It added a new dimension in my life because having lived in South Asia and then moving into London, I've been here 20 years now. For me also, reading all these books, I started understanding where people are coming from because I didn't know the amount of strife, the tsunamis, the riots, the things that go on in South Asian literature. Actually, that is how our psychology is made up. And I work with women and street children, and this is where, a street child would come from if there's a tsunami or if there's a riot or there's strife. This is where the constituents I work with also come from. So when I read this literature, I understand more the work that I'm doing. South Asian literature gives you the context of that region, which sometimes mystifies the generation who do not know the history and thus the psychology of the people. There used to be a tradition in Britain's history of doing an ethnography of the place, of the people they wish to engage with for war or business. The museums of this country bear witness to that culture. We need that tradition back if we want to stop the endless conflict and war. I wish more people would read South Asian literature. It is full of context. South Asian literature gives you the context of that region, which sometimes mystifies the generation who do not know the history and thus the psychology of the people. There used to be a tradition in Britain's history of doing an ethnography of the place, of the people they wish to engage with for war or business. The museums of this country bear witness to that culture. We need that tradition back if we want to stop the endless conflict and war. I wish more people would read South Asian literature. It is full of context.
We have had to deal with 75 books. That was it was great fun. It was also an ordeal, if I may say so. The variety was considerable. We've had huge historical sagas, novels dealing with Naxalites, diasporas, murder mystery. There was a book called Murder in Melur. The 1984 riots in Delhi, you've just seen Jaspreet Singh's book, The Helium. And where action seems to be taking a global jaunt, Kabul, New York, Oxford, London. That is in the light of what we know, one of the novels. A schizophrenic girl from Bihar who imagines long conversations with Sylvia Plath and William Blake. A seemingly innocent book, heavy with the aftermath, rather the after-vibes of the Sri Lankan civil war. And a novel by Kamila Shamsi deals with the life of a soldier who fought in the Great War in 1914-18. The variety is endless from what we have read. And while there were good novels and not so good novels, it must be said that almost none were dull. And here I am reminded of T.S. Eliot's statement at the end of the essay, Apology for the Countess of Pembroke, to the effect that, and I'm quoting, "The worst fault that poetry can commit is to be dull." The same could be, unquote, the same could be said of creative literature, especially fiction. People come to fiction as against modern poetry for entertainment. We each of us judged a particular book as a whole. Of course, we had set out criteria as a sort of a shadowy guide. Originality, the concept of the plot overall, characters and how they develop, and of course the texture of the language. But the texture of the language would not be an impediment if it was a translation, and we have one translation in the shortlist, if I may say so. The way the writer, he or she, handles the novel tells us whether the novelist is a practiced fiction writer or no. We were near unanimous about the list, and whatever discussions took place, they were on email till we met here. You have a very fine mix in the shortlist. We have people, we have writers from at least 3 countries who've done extremely well. This is a tremendous saga. I mean, it could remind you of Forsyth Saga or something. And the way a lady who's very, very beautiful and who is a historical character, incidentally, she's a real character, I mean, she existed. How she manages, how she gets, in a way, married to Marston Blake, but the East India Company officers took BBs in those days and possibly did not marry them. She had two sons and once he was killed in Jaipur in a riot because the Attorney General of Jaipur was going to usurp the throne in a way, murder the Raja and become the regent of an infant prince. That used to happen all along in those terrible days. I would like to read a very small passage, if you don't mind. It took a great deal of argument before Wazir is the name of the lady, Wazir Khanum, Wazir could persuade Marston Blake to approve the name Badshah Begum for their first daughter. He refused to consider any other name than Sophia, a name that identified her as a Christian. After a great amount of discussion in the first instance, he agreed to Masih Jan, a name that was vaguely Muslim and could also be taken as Christian. Choti Begum turned her face away from everyone present and swore on oath that she did not mind the baby being taken away from her, but she would not ever look at her if she was to be named just Sophia. Marston Blake softened a little, and there was more disputation and contestation before it was agreed that the Badshah Begum too would be one of the infant names, but she must be baptized as Sophia, though the mullah would utter the ritual call to prayer in the baby's ear with Badshah Begum as a name. Thank you.
I'm talking about a tale of ill-fated love, straddling race and ethnicity, spanning antiquity and colonialism, bestriding continents and topography, as well as the history and events that befall the protagonists. In other words, it is a nuanced depiction of unrequited love and loss, in which fate and human agency dovetail one another. It is a novel that revisits, recaptures, and reinterprets the violence of past times in what seems to be an emerging common strand in contemporary South Asian literature. In other words, it is a resourceful account of subaltern colonial history before the partition between India and Pakistan. It is a book of vivid visual imagination achieved through an ambitious span and scope, bold in its creativeness and craft. In other words, let me give you in the words of the author. Miss Spencer, there's a gentleman to see you from the War Office. To see me? That can't be right. Your father said you must go in immediately on arrival. Without changing out of her nurse's uniform, the one-armed footman said yes. Dr. Spencer had been clear in his instructions. Viv took off her cap, smoothed down her hair, pinched colour into her cheeks, and walked into the parlour where an unknown man was filling an armchair, though his frame was slight. Her father stood up to greet her with the broadest of smiles, while her mother covered her mouth with a hand in horror, managing to make Viv feel it was her fault that she had had to come in without brushing her hair or changing into more presentable clothing. There you are. We were just talking about you, about your summer in Turkey, her father said. Those wonderful maps you made of your walk up the coast. Her sketchbooks from Turkey were piled onto a table next to the unknown man, whipped thin with a pince-nez balanced on the end of his nose, and one of them was in his hands. These are remarkable, the man said, standing up and directing a slightly awkward smile at her, as though his mouth wasn't accustomed to forming that shape. Such detail. When the ambassador suggested that you might have something interesting to impart with about your time in Turkey, none of us could have imagined this. I'm sorry, imagine what? The gentleman from the War Office believes your drawings would be useful to the Maps Division, her father answered. He intends to send them to Cairo. No, she said. Her voice was almost a shriek. You can't have them. The man was still holding on to one of the sketchbooks, splayed open. She could see her drawing of the cove where Tashin Bey had found a length of emerald seaweed and draped it over her wrist. Vivian, her father kept his voice low, the slight edge to it, all that was necessary to silence her, and the whip-thin man gestured to her to take a seat as if this was his house. Miss Spencer, I assure you they'll be returned to you very soon in perfect condition. I just need to make copies and send them to Lawrence and Woolley. T.E. Lawrence, Leonard Woolley, are men in Cairo, but they are archaeologists. They are the great travelers and explorers and linguists of the age. In times of war, such men are indispensable. What about such women? Both men laughed at this, and her father said, I told you she wasn't like other men's daughters. Viv lowered her head and looked away from the laughing men. For just a moment, she had imagined herself in Cairo, standing in the shadow of the pyramids with Lawrence and Woolley, drawing a map of the Turkish coastline in sand to their cries of admiration. Her mother caught her eye, pursed her lips together, and shook her head with that sharply honed ability to know when Viv was thinking a thought that might harm her marital prospects. A God in every stone, Kamila Shamsi.
A bomb goes off in the city of Karachi, and chapter by chapter, this finalist for the 2015 DSC Prize for South Asian Literature conjures the lives this event touches, disrupts, and even destroys. A small boy rides to the beach and rides a camel, Old poet boards the bus with verses in his pocket and a chip on his shoulder about his adult son. A teenage boy is sneaking off to meet his secret lover while his mother naps. A grandmother wrings her hands with the shame this brings her family. A car recovery agent turned thief combs the city for a missing Nissan. Told in a variety of voices, in language that is gritty and poetically vernacular, while all Tanweers to scatter here is too great, weaves these stories and more into a tapestry of profound beauty, a book about the bonds and betrayals that come to life when a city of more than 20 million are made to pause and contemplate the limits of narrative before terrible loss. Please listen now as I read a section to you. The plan is simple: to make it impossible to locate 2219. That's my ticket to watch Chief getting kicked in the balls, and who knows, to put an end to his company. His company has a name, Chief Security Services, but when Chief and I started out, we simply used to call it Uchakas, very loosely, the lifters. Our task is to locate and recover cars that are on the list. The list comes from the bank of cars whose installments have not come in for 3 months or more. We have the bank's license and court's permit to do this, but at the end of the day, it's a private business. That is, no one's going to step in and save us if someone sends a bamboo ripping up through our ass and beyond. I didn't write this, I'm really sorry. But it's wonderful, but it's got dirty words, so sorry, Mrs. Narilla. Well, actually, not sure I'm sorry, but anyway. The good thing is we have guns and can shoot in self-defense. We have court protection for that. How I joined this business is a story. I was out of college and doing nothing when Chief asked me to become a partner in his company. That was 2 years back. It would just be the two of us, he said. We'll keep it low-key, share the profits 40-60. 40% looked good to me, especially because I was not doing any of the accounts or anything in the office. He explained how it worked. He got me a gun, the permits, and for transport we were going to ride his bike. We were set. Our first case, we were looking for a maroon Nissan Sunny that had vanished, no traces. We tried the standard methods, called the guy up, said words to the women in the house, sent a few drunken boys to smash a few things around his house. But the bastard knew somebody who knew somebody, a lawyer. We sent a legal notice to the bank for harassment, who sent bamboos up our cheeks, and we had to stop the indirect methods. Then one day, early in the morning, too early, Chief called and said he had picked up the trail of the car. When we got there, we found the car outside the man's house. His wife was in the driver's seat, brushing her cheek with a blush on, when Chief walked up from the side and pulled out the gun at her. She walked up from the side and pulled... She howled and flashed her nail-polished hands at his face. He backed up a couple of steps and kicked the side of the door and yelled at her out of his gut, his sticky early morning spit flying out of his mouth. When she stepped out of the car, Chief caught her arm and yanked her aside and got into the car. He was about to turn the ignition when a stinking meat heap of a man walked out of the door with a pistol hanging in his hand. He pointed at Chief's car, but before he could fire, I fired 2 shots in the air. He sneaked back in and fired at my bike. I didn't get hit, but the guy tried. We drove off to the police station to get the FIR registered and report the car as recovered. That was the first case, and it taught me my most important lesson. Even when it gets messy, get out as cleanly as possible.
I'm going to be announcing Chopal Lahiri's Lowland. It's personally one of my favorites on the list, so I'm glad that I'm going to be reading out from it. It's set in Bengal, with the Naxalites being one of the key motifs of the book, and how it greatly influences families, often tears them apart, and eventually heals. So without further ado, I'm going to go straight into Lahiri's language and read out from the book some of the most moving passages, in my opinion. Now he stood at the edge of a lowland, in the enclave where he'd lived all his life. It was an October evening, Toliganj at dusk, the week before Durga Puja. His parents were pleading with the police, insisting he was innocent. but it was they who were innocent of the things he'd done. His hands were bound behind him, the rope chafing his skin. This discomfort preoccupied him. He was told to turn around. It was too late to run or to fight. So he stood and waited, his back to his family, but not seeing them. The last he'd seen of his parents was the ground at their feet as he bent down to ask for their pardon. The softened rubber slippers his father wore around the house, the dark brown border of the mother's sari, the end of it draped over her face and wrapped around her shoulders, held by her fingers at her throat. It was only Gauri he'd managed to look in the face. At the moment, his hands were being restrained. He could have turned away from her without having done that. He knew that he was no hero to her. He had lied to her and used her, and yet he had loved her. A bookish girl, heedless of her beauty, unconscious of her effect, she'd been prepared to live her life alone. But from the moment he'd known her, he'd needed her. And now he was about to abandon her. Or was it she abandoning him? For she looked at him as she'd never looked before. It was a look of disillusion, a revision of everything they'd once shared. They pushed him into the back of the van and started the engine. He felt the vibration of the door slamming shut. They would take him somewhere outside the city to question him, then finish him off. Either that or to prison. But no, they'd already cut the engine. The van had stopped. The door opened. He was pulled out again. They were in the field where he'd come so many times with Subhash. They asked him nothing. They untied his hands, then pointed, indicating that he was to walk in a certain direction now, again with his hands raised over his head. Slowly, he heard them say, "Make sure to pause after every step." He did as he was told. Step by step, he walked away from them. "Go back to your family," they said, but he knew they were only waiting for him to fall into the ideal range. One step, then another. He started counting. How many more? Thank you.
This is Ramesh, but the Noontide told by Ramesh Gunasekara from Sri Lanka. A very different writer. Each one of our writers has brought his or her own specificity, a sense of his or her own place, of his or her own exile. And this one is set in Ramesh's native Sri Lanka, a country recovering from nearly 30 years of bitter civil war, as well as, of course, the tsunami. It is a fascinating, amusing, troubling, and often deeply moving book. We were uncertain as to whether it is a novel or a collection of short stories, but it doesn't matter because it is a glorious and thoughtful piece of writing. Told by its narrator, a van driver. We all know how taxi drivers have opinions. Some listen, some talk, some do both. And here, the van driver tells stories of his encounters in each section with various passengers. Stories which question in different ways and from different points of view whether we can ever leave the past behind us. Beautifully written, with insightful observation of both people and places, the book is thoughtful and often wise, infused with melancholy, as so many of our books are, yet also infused with an undertone of pragmatism and ultimately even of optimism. The brief extract which I would like to read to you now is from the encounter that our van driver had with a brigadier, a massive megastar brigadier general who enjoys regal treatment throughout the island because of his wartime heroics, which had led to the killing of many people on the enemy side and indeed on his own side. But he also receives massive treatment as a kind of latter-day Elvis Presley because he is a god of the dance floor. So we've got this extraordinary brigadier who incarnates, if you like, all that military can be in both negative and positive sides, and with all of the showmanship and also the superficiality of the ballroom dancer. He goes to meet an old woman whose son has died, stays time with another woman in the guest house, and comes out meeting one of his foreign soldiers, a young man who has lost a brother in one of the operations directed by the brigadier. He lost his own leg, and his father, having believed that both his brother and himself were killed in this operation, committed suicide out of despair and grief. This young man has been found a job by the army as part of its reparation to those who had served it, counting, as he puts it, fish. The brigadier corrects him brusquely and says prawns, tiger prawns, for Tehran. And in this moment of bitterness, when the young man says, "You never understood what we were doing, you never understood what you were asking us to do," he says simply, "You got your compensation, get over it, boy, move on." Now, the van driver for Shanta. Fish, prawns, tigers are not my business. I carry people, on average about 70 kilos each. What they carry on their consciences, in their hearts, guilt or grievance, is not for me to judge. I might sometimes help them unburden, but that is only partly out of curiosity. It is also my service. Same as the barber or the dentist, although with the razor and the drill they have an advantage that tends to keep their mouths open while their customers have their mouths occupied. They go on talking. I talk to aerate the van, to keep it bubbling. As far as I am concerned, what we talk about on the road is what we feel deep inside. You don't get that deep if you just sit still. Whatever the yogis, the barbers, and the dentists say, you need the sense of motion, your body hurtling through space. Then your thoughts can really move in your head. And if the conversation doesn't go beyond the parking situation at Odell's or the price of onions at Food City, well, that's just the way you are. It's not that you are trivial, only that that's the life that you lead. When we first heard the war was over, we believed a line could be drawn between the mistakes of the past and the promise of the future. One was the place you had been, the other was the place you were going to. We believed that there was no need for the two to be connected. But as a driver, I should have known better. To go from one to the other, you need a road, and a road is nothing if it doesn't connect. Noontide Toll by Romesh Gunasekara.